Do you know if somebody's going to cue me? Morning. So good morning to everybody here in the room, and well done for coming all the way up the stairs to the Panorama Room 1 on a grey, cool but refreshing Monday morning. I just want to check that I'm live and online. Oh, I see myself. That is very disturbing. Good. All right. Good day to everybody online, and thank you for joining us for the first, in parallel, but the first morning of sessions at the third World Data Forum. And it is very good to see people here. And if I was very clever, I would see you online as well, but I don't. But I trust you are there, and give you a warm welcome. Welcoming you also on behalf of the CCSA, the excitingly named Committee for the Coordination of Statistical Activities, which is the group which has instigated this session. I would like to just say a few words to situate the discussion this morning, and then we will move to hear from our panel of experts, and then to hear from you experts with your questions, which I hope will be very difficult, and I will pass them to my good friends to be able to answer them in great style. But we're here because we're living in a world where data are becoming so plentiful that every few years we have to invent a new word to describe their number. So zettabytes are now in my vocabulary, and I have no doubt there will be something else bytes very soon to be able to describe this explosion of data. I think it is actually one of the few increases that can genuinely be called exponential, as opposed to the way that the word exponential is used to the great annoyance of statisticians and mathematicians around the world to mean big. But this proliferation in data, it's simultaneously a tremendous opportunity to bring about change for good, to understand the fundamental barriers to life, living, and livelihood, and surmount those barriers. But like every technological advance, there is a concomitant danger. The greater the potential for good, the greater the potential peril. Think of artificially designed drugs to cure diseases and the perils of bioterrorism, the increased power of nuclear medicine and the perils of nuclear explosions, the curative powers of genetic manipulation and the perils of cloning and humans made to order. And it's not only the data themselves that have power, it's the accompanying rise of new technologies, especially but not only those based in artificial intelligence and its subset of machine learning, to analyze those data in ways which are not just not intuitive to understand, but increasingly a black box of machines teaching themselves in ways we cannot follow and double-check. It is at this exciting and enthralling cusp in history that we find ourselves needing both to encourage the good and limit the perils of this explosion of data. So, this call is for a data convention to give guide rails to the private sector where most data now reside to protect and responsibly share those data. Guide rails similarly for governments to take care of the personal data they have and to limit their exploitation of data to purposes that benefit their citizens. Guide rails for non-governmental organizations to push for and safeguard the personal data that is held and used. And, of course, for the member states' institutions to lead and coordinate and build capacity for all. So, it is to address this call for a convention, a global data convention, that we have four distinguished speakers to kick off the thinking. And I need to check that one of them is online. I only see one. Malar, are you also online? Do I see you somewhere?
Yes, I am.
Oh,
Hi.
Jolly good. Excellent. Good. I look up into space somewhere and you appear miraculously in front of me, so that's great. So we have Milan Verapan, who's the Senior Data Scientist and Program Manager for Data Management and Services in the World Bank. We have Pilar Fajarnes, the Economic Affairs Officer in UNCTAD, and both of them are online. We have, sitting on my right and your left, Rory Macmillan, who's a partner in Macmillan Keck Attorneys and Solicitors. And on my left, Steve McFeely, the Director of Data and Analytics in the World Health Organization. I will not spend more of our precious hour introducing them. You can read their bios online. I would like to turn immediately to Malar to invite you to speak. Thank you.
Recording in progress.
Hi, can you hear me all clearly? Okay.
We hear you well here, yes.
Thank you, Mark. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Malar Veerapan, and today I wear the hat of the report manager for the World Development Report 2021 Data for Better Lives. It's great to be here today, and I will provide a quick overview of the recommendations from the report, which hopefully sets a little bit of the context for today's discussion. Next slide, please. Let me begin with an example. In 2013, when a cyclone ripped through India's Odisha state, nearly 1 million people were evacuated. But the loss of life, while tragic, was limited to 38. Only 14 years earlier, in 1999, a similar storm caused almost 10,000 fatalities. What made the difference? Odisha's Disaster Management Authority had invested in weather forecast data, and efficiently using and disseminating the data helped them implement disaster response measures, which helped ultimately save many lives. In this example, the government actors use data effectively for positive outcomes. Next slide, please. But other actors can also use data to improve outcomes. So to guide our thinking in the report, we use the conceptual framework that you see on this slide, where we have 3 primary pathways by which data is produced and by which data can lead to better outcomes. The key set of actors are governments and international organizations running through the central pathway, individuals, civil society, and academia running through the top channel, and private sector running through the bottom channel. Next slides. There are several examples that we cover in the report where actors outside of the government have produced and used data for better development outcomes. One example is HarassMap, a citizen-led initiative that mapped out individual reports of sexual harassment in an effort to promote change and create safe spaces in Egypt. Next slide. When civil society and individuals and academia use data, it can be a powerful force to create greater transparency and accountability of both public and private sectors. Governments can use data to improve programs, policies, and the targeting of scarce resources to marginalized people and areas. And when private firms use data, they can improve decision-making and efficiency and better match supply with demand. They can use data to fuel platform-based business models that can stimulate economic activity and international trade and services. All of these lead to economic growth and improve the lives of the people. Next slide. Many of us are enthusiastic people who believe in the power of data to help people. But we also clearly recognize that data is a double-edged sword and has great potential to harm people. Mark provided some of the examples in his introductory remarks. For example, a government could use data to undertake political surveillance or target certain social groups for discrimination. Private sector actors could exploit market power arising from data to take advantage of their customers, or individuals could access data illegally for criminal purposes. We devote a great deal of discussion around this in the report because without properly addressing these concerns, this future where data is a powerful positive force is in danger, creating a world of missed opportunities. Next slide. A distinction of the World Development Report relative to many other reports on data is that we focus on how these issues affect poor people in poor countries. Concerns about any of these issues are particularly relevant for poor people and marginalized groups who are less likely to be reflected in data and are less likely to participate in the data economy. And many of the concerns are even more salient in poor countries where institutional and regulatory frameworks that ensure safe and ethical use of data are typically weaker. Next slide. A central attribute of data is that it's non-rivalrous or completely reusable. And yet data is frequently used once and filed away. For this reason, we assert in the report that much of the value of data to improve lives is left untapped. An important message of the report is that we all need to work to find ways to get more value out of data, find ways to reuse data, to repurpose data, to find insights to unexpected problems. This means greater access to data and greater sharing of data. This is what we're aiming to convey in the middle part of the framework, where you see arrows running back and forth across all the data uses in the society. In Uganda, for example, to improve procurement outcomes, local government entities made administrative procurement data from the bidding process available to civil society. The civil society organizations train community members to understand the information in the contracts and to conduct site checks to verify. The findings led to reforms to ensure the contracts comply with national procurement standards, and the National Procurement Agency ultimately upgraded its procurement portal to meet international contracting norms, making Uganda the first country to do so. Next slide. Disadvantaged groups are sometimes left out of government efforts to collect data because governments fail to acknowledge inclusion of those groups as a policy objective. Individuals must then collect the data needed to empower themselves. That data, when merged with existing data sets, can help fill a gap that neither the public sector nor the private sector can fill. In Bogota, Colombia, for example, the city government used a map-based mobile app called Safety Pin to map safety around bike paths. The biking community helped collect images along 230 kilometers of bike paths in the city, which were then analyzed by Safety Pin, as shown in the map here. This analysis supported the authorities in understanding where to improve lighting and add closed-circuit TV cameras and bike stands so as to make women feel safer using the bike paths after dark. The data was also then reused by the municipal government by integrating other data sets for land use planning purposes. Next slide. All this reuse and repurposing of data are opening doors to development impacts previously unimaginable. So how do we ensure greater production, access, and use of data that meets the needs of all individuals in the society? Why would people be willing to participate in calls for collecting and using more data? In the report, we argue that one large part of the answer lies in the realization of a new social contract for data. Next slide. First, any sort of agreement requires that participants have something to gain from the contract, that value is created through the agreement. Realizing greater value from data requires both that more people have access to data and that data is shared more, reused more, and repurposed to solve development problems. Next slide. That means it requires participation of all people. Improving economic and social well-being ensures that data coverage, infrastructure, training data all include poor people and poor countries, including marginalized groups. The only way to ensure people participate is to ensure everyone gains from participation. One dimension of equity is coverage. That is to say that data covers all people. As one example of this is the lack of data coverage of women that is a particular problem across the world. Next slide. And finally, without trust, there's no reason that people will participate. People need to trust that value will be created and that they will share in some of the benefits of the value created and that they will not be harmed from the use of the data. The second part of the report provides significant discussion on the safeguards necessary to protect people from misuse of data. This is also more, I'm sure all of you followed this in the context of the recent COVID-19 pandemic. Ultimately, they also need to trust in the integrity of data, and that is used in transparent ways, and that they are able to trust the validity and quality of data. Next slide. In the report, we're very clear that social contracts will be different in all countries, reflecting the heterogeneity of cultures, values, and laws. But we assert that all social contracts need to be based on value, trust, and equity. It's important to recognize that social contracts have existed for centuries, and they're reflected in legal systems across the world. But we need these contracts to adapt to this new world where data is deeply interwoven into our lives. Next slide. While social contracts provide the rules and compliance mechanisms for how data can be safely shared, used, and reused by all stakeholders, to fully realize data's potential, this framework must be built around data systems that not only ensure safety, but also actively promotes access to data. The World Development Report offers an aspirational vision of what we're calling an integrated national data system, or INDS. INDS aims to enhance data flows across different stakeholders, allowing all to benefit from data use and facilitating innovative, creative uses of data to solve existing and, quite importantly, emerging problems. Well, it's clear that for most of the countries that are a focus of this report, they are very far away from this aspiration. Nonetheless, it's important to provide a clear description of what countries should be aiming for as they take steps towards improving the use of data. But what does it take to implement this social contract? Next slide. How do we go from the conceptual nature of the social contract to creating the ambitious integrated data systems? All this requires tremendous improvements in data governance frameworks in all countries. Here in this slide, we discuss the data governance framework as a series of 4 pillars. Today, I'm not going to go into detail, but in the report, we allocate a chapter for each of these governance pillars with more detailed recommendations. Next slide. There are several important considerations for governing data effectively that we discuss in the report, but I'll highlight one here, which is the multi-stakeholder approach to data governance. In the report, we argue that this approach is better equipped to govern the complex data ecosystem in a transparent, inclusive, and distributed way, which reflects the interests of all key stakeholders. Given the global scale of the data ecosystem, some of the most challenging aspects of the social contract call for closer international cooperation to harmonize principles, regulations, and coordinate policies that will enable data use while protecting against harmful misuse of data. The global consensus, which is the topic of today's discussion, is a form of such a multi-stakeholder governance, and Steve will discuss the details later. Next slide. Here I am going to leave you with some of the key points from today's discussion. Thank you all, and I'm really looking forward to the rest of the discussion here. Next slide. Thank you very much. Back to you, Mark.
Okay, thank you very much, Malara, and thank you for that admirable summary of the World Development Report and people online, I know, dropped off partway through the presentation, actually where your very coolest graphics were. So I recommend everyone online to get a copy and catch up on those few slides that they missed in the middle. But that was really excellent. Thanks so much. We would now like to bounce to Geneva to Pilar Fajanes in UNCTAD, who was the main author on the Digital Economy Report, which complements this thinking and provides another view. So Pilar, over to you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hear you well, thank you.
Okay, good. Hello, everybody. I thank you, the organizers, the opportunity to share with you the main findings of the Digital Economy Report, which we published last week. The topic of the report is cross-border data flows and development, for whom the data flow. So we are focusing more on the international dimension of data, but we are starting with the point that data are becoming increasingly important, not only as an economic, but also as a strategic resource. If they are well managed, they can help us address some of the global development challenges, of the major challenges that we are facing, such as the pandemic and climate change. But if they are badly handled, they can generate highly unequal development outcomes, they can have negative impacts on human rights and on security, and they can undermine the functioning of the internet. As Mark mentioned, we are seeing data flow surging amidst huge divides in digital readiness. For example, one major number is to some estimations that say that global internet traffic in the single year of 2022 is expected to exceed all internet traffic up to 2026. And if we look at the international dimensions, even if one of the main problems in this area is about measurement of data, so data about data, international bandwidth is geographically concentrated in just two main routes, which is between North America and Europe and between North America and Asia, particularly in China. And all this explosion in data is taking place in a context of huge device in connectivity in countries, within countries and among countries. Like half of the world population is still offline, and in least developed countries, only 1 in 5 people uses the internet. And we also see 2 major digital economy frontrunners in terms of country, which is the United States and China. And these countries are concentrating most of the technologies for example, they account for half of the world hyperscale data centers, the highest rates of 5G adoption, 94% of all funding of AI startups, and 70% of the world top AI researcher. So also, most of the major digital platforms that are running in internet belong or are from these countries. Like 90% of the market capitalization of the world largest digital platforms is in these countries. And these platforms are strengthening their positions along the entire global data value chain, from data collection, transmission, storage to data analysis. For example, to use artificial intelligence. These platforms in the pandemic, because we have all continued our lives to the extent possible online, have strengthened the position. So they have strengthened the power over data and their control. And what we see is basically that data is a development issue. Because what we are seeing or showing in the report is that the digital divide, the traditional digital divide, is becoming also a data-driven divide. But against this backdrop, what we see also is that despite the importance of data in the evolving digital economy, there is no universally agreed understanding of the concept of data and the dynamics of data flows. In the report, we are stressing that data are multidimensional. From an economic perspective, they can provide both private value for those who collect and control the data and social value for the whole economy. Also, the distribution of private income gains from data is currently highly unequal and needs to be addressed, which we see, therefore, that there is a need for policymaking to support efficiency and equity objectives. And there are also non-economic dimensions, as I mentioned, related to privacy and other human rights and on national security. So there are many development issues at stake that developing countries, policymakers around the world need to face. And there are questions that maybe need to be addressed, or they relate to how to maximize the potential gains and minimizing the risk and concerns, how to promote more equitable distribution of the gains and handle complex trade-offs, how to find middle ground solutions that both enable data to flow while addressing various concerns, and how to identify what needs to be done at the national, regional, and global levels. If we look at the policies that are being applied currently, we find that there is a diverging data governance approaches that raise the risk of fragmentation in the digital space. The approaches vary greatly among the major players in the digital economy, and there is little consensus at the international and regional levels. If we think about it in some way simplified manner, the approach of the United States is focusing on the control of the data by the private sector. The Chinese model emphasizes control of the data by the government, and the European Union favors control of data by individuals. This current context is mainly one of tensions about the major data realms. And this fragmentation of data governance is bad for development. It goes against the original spirit of the internet as a free, decentralized, and open network, hampers technological progress, and really has negative impacts on most developing countries. Because there is no really an international governance system for data, what the normal reaction for developing countries or countries in general is to apply national policies, but there is no one-size-fits-all solution. The national policies are determined by national conditions, depending on economic conditions, institutional conditions, social conditions, and they are directed to meeting different public policy objectives such as economic development, protection of privacy, law enforcement, and national security. And at the national level, there can be a number of instruments that can be used that they can range from data protection laws to cybersecurity and taxation policies. And again, this shows that the data have a multifaceted nature. There are also different regulations on data flows that they are increasingly coming in the international agreements. They are now one of the main areas is related to in the trade agreements. So, for example, we have the joint statement initiatives at the WTO, and there are also many initiatives at the regional level. However, what we see is that current regional and international regulatory frameworks tend to be either too narrow in scope or too limited geographically, failing to enable cross-border data flows with an equitable sharing of economic development gains while properly addressing the risk involved. So there is a need to look for a balanced global governance approach that works for people on the planet. We need to find this balanced global governance approach that is important to meet different objectives, which would be to prevent inequalities from being amplified, to enable global data sharing and develop global public goods, to avoid further fragmentation in the digital space, to increase trust in the digital economy and reduce uncertainty, to address policy challenges emerging from the dominant positions of digital platforms, and to account for spillovers of national policies into other currencies. This would be with a view to enabling data to flow across borders as freely as necessary and as possible while addressing various development objectives. And this could include different data-related policy areas related to definitions, agreeing on definitions and taxonomies, establishing terms of access of data, strengthening measurement of data and data flows, dealing with data as a global public good, exploring emerging forms of data governance, agreeing on rights and principles, developing standards, and increasing international cooperation on platform governance. In order to remedy the current underrepresentation of developing countries in global and regional initiatives, we see that the United Nations at the most inclusive forum in terms of country representation would need to play a key role. The report recommends the creation of a new United Nations coordinating body with a clear mandate to work on data-related issues and with the right skill set up for that purpose. Some of the key data-related policies I already mentioned, and this initiative, this global governance framework would need to be multidimensional, multi-stakeholder, and multilateral initiativity, building from already existing initiatives in the UN and beyond. Thank you very much. This is everything I wanted to say, and I think this links very much with the proposal of the Global Data Convention.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Pilar. That's amazing, and it's a really good report, and highlighting the digital divide not getting any better and the data divide, but then also looking to see how we can improve it. So traditionally, when one is in trouble, one finds a lawyer, and I think we've been hearing that we're in trouble globally. There's this explosion of data. There is not a good way of governing it, and so we want to turn to Rory now to be able to hear from a legal perspective the challenges and the opportunities that may arise.
Thank you, Mark. I want to touch on two themes. One is how do we use our scarce diplomatic resources best to negotiate these issues? And the second is more the private sector perspective, because I think I was asked not only as a lawyer, but particularly bringing a bit of a private sector perspective in, to offer a little thought on the relevance of this kind of work, and how to make sure that it is relevant in all the ways that we just talked about. I think that the WDR and the UNCTAD report are really extremely strong documents. But coming back to the title of our session, do we need an international convention on data? If we remind ourselves what data is, we're talking about nuggets, representations, bits of representations of reality in personal lives, in all corporate business, in government, effectively everything. I think that the name of such a convention should be called the Convention on Everything. And I say that to offer a kind of counterintuitive sense of the absurdity of trying to capture everything in a single convention. The WDR itself is a very large document which covers a huge amount of matters and calls for a social contract, but I do question whether it's sensible to be trying to embody everything here, whether it's proprietary data, personal data, use of data for security purposes, competition issues in data, all the economic policies. Essentially, this is essentially a policy on economic policy in a convention. I think maybe it reminds me of the Jorge Luis Borges story about the king who wanted to map his kingdom, and he called on his cartographers and his specialists, and he said, I want a map of the kingdom, but I want the map to be life-size. Right. So we have to be very sensible how we target the diplomatic activities we have. Pilar just very usefully mentioned the kind of different visions of the European Union, very focused on protecting personal data. The Chinese, the integration of commercial and state use of data, and with very limited limitations on how far that goes, or the US drive on the commercial side. I would add also the perhaps unaligned movement, to borrow a phrase from the Cold War, which is concerned about a kind of neo-colonialism where large Western modern corporations are essentially plunging, using the raw resources of our existence, and not now so much the copper or other, but actually the very data from our lives to recolonialize ourselves. I think these are all different visions that we have in parts of the world of the future, and trying to encapsulate in a convention a consensus across this really quite basically the chasms between these different visions of the future, while the technologies are changing as fast as they are, while definitions are shifting, even getting the common meaning of words that we would use in conventions is going to shift within years. And as we jostle for the future, as countries, regions, companies are struggling to win that future, increasingly in the area of artificial intelligence, for example, it's going to be a real challenge to get a convention. So what I think I'm interested in is how we focus on really vital areas where that diplomatic resource, putting our international organizations and our foreign, our state departments at work, really negotiating useful things is important. Now we have some, of course, we have many existing conventions and treaties and so on. Cybercrime, there's the Budapest Convention, or in regional levels you might have the African Convention on Cybersecurity and personal data. We have work at the WTO, but at the same time, as Pilar mentioned, we also have a large number of bilateral trade agreements, which are also creating clusters of norms around what can be done with personal data. And some of these are helpful, some of these are not necessarily helpful because they may contradict one another, and in some cases, particularly free trade agreements coming with countries such as, particularly the Anglophone countries, will limit what governments can do in terms of their national legislation to limit the way data may be used. We have the European Union's GDPR, of course, which has got its extraterritorial impact and is influencing a lot. So there's a lot happening, and I think we need to target our resources. And so bringing that private sector perspective, relevance, what really, vast amount, as Mark said at the beginning, really huge amount of the data now is held in the private sector. And the private sector is where an awful lot of the innovation will happen. I just met yesterday the CEO from Isoko, who's here, who's telling me about the way that his company is really using data right across West Africa and East Africa for agricultural programs. It's that kind of initiative that I think is really to be encouraged for developmental purposes. So what does the private sector need to do that? Well, three things that we need to see. One is for the data to be made available. There's a huge amount of data that is simply not made available, whether it's in government hands. Open data policies are still pretty limited in the way they're implemented, or whether it's in the hands of private companies, telecom operators, banks, where some of that data, if organized well, could be made available. A lot of the problem is it's in silos, it's organized in ways that you cannot aggregate it and use it effectively. You need more unique identifiers, perhaps national digital identification systems can help by using identification numbers and things like that, but again with safeguards, of course. So availability, very important to get governments to take steps nationally to make it available. Secondly, usable, as I mentioned, the silos. And the third is to allow sufficient, or not to suppress too much commercial incentives, because if you do that, then it simply, companies simply won't happen. So, clearly we have some major commercial incentive problems in the antitrust competition scenario, where something like 95% of the revenues from use of data are being made by Google and Facebook in at least the larger economies. So we do have concerns around the exploitation for commercial incentives, but we can't suppress it too much. That's going to really hold back the use of data for development. So just to conclude, we need to focus our resources in targeted areas where there are needs. I would say that perhaps more than a global convention, because we can list all of the many issues that are coming up, and they will keep coming up and keep changing. But I think identifying issues that have uncertainties doesn't mean we should just move to, well, we need a global convention to settle all this. That's a little bit too quick. We need to focus on where governments can make a major difference by making commitments. One is to commit that they themselves do not, and that they do not fund, support, allow out of their territories the sorts of attacks, unauthorized access to data and abuse of data that we see. More and more of that kind of commitment in treaties, I think, is very important. As Pilar mentioned, cross-border data is really vital. You cannot develop your economy if you don't have access to cloud services. We see a lot of countries now with sort of a data nationalism, introducing laws which are holding back the ability of data to cross borders. What we need is to facilitate that, but in a manner that's trusted, secure, and that can be done. We have a lot of models now for how to do that. We need to, I think, really support, maybe not through a convention, but through an awful lot of advisory, capacity building, good development of good practices, support governments as they prepare their own national frameworks. I could go on and on, Mark, but I think you'll want to.
Thank you. No, thanks so very much, Rory, and thank you for challenging us to see where we should be spending our scarce resources of time and diplomatic energy and capital. Very helpful and great insights from the private sector, as you mentioned. Last but never least, Steve McFeely, would you like to reintroduce the CCSA and what we are thinking?
Hello. So good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening to those who are joining us online. I'm representing the CCSA, and I'll say a little bit about that in a moment. And we are asking the question, do we need a global convention to achieve sustainable development? So for the longest time, we thought of data as an input, as a byte that we feed into a computer, a tool to inform decision making. But I think now it's fair to say that data is now a policy issue in and of itself. And I think the fact that the World Bank and UNCTAD have both dedicated flagship reports to data and to data flows, that tells you something in itself. And it gives you an indication of just how important data has become. And given the importance of data to the globalized digital economy, to surveillance or dataveillance, to politics, to artificial intelligence, I think with maybe the exception of climate or inequality, there's going to be few more important geopolitical issues than data in the coming years. So the question is, do we need to and can we regulate data and data flows in some sort of coherent, holistic way? Or do we just let it happen piecemeal, fragmented, and then we run the risks that Malar, I think, clearly articulated and Pilar articulated? And that's really the question that we're asking. So just to step back for a second and say a little bit about the CCSA. The CCSA is the Committee for the Coordination of Statistical Activities. It's not a very revealing title. But what it is, it's basically the chief statisticians of all the international organizations. So the UN organizations, plus World Bank, plus OECD, plus Eurostat, plus development banks, and so forth. This group, we meet regularly, we discuss issues, but our main focus is to try and coordinate statistical activities across the international scene. So to try and build common standards and platforms, develop methodologies that we share, support each other, develop capacity development, advocate for statistics, and most importantly, to try and coordinate our activities so we try and minimize the burden that we place on countries and help them as much as we can. And it's this group has been reflecting on the changing nature of data. So even though our main focus has been statistics, we're intrinsically linked to the data world, and we've been reflecting on what's going on. As Mark pointed out in his introductory remarks, we're having to invent ever ludicrous kind of words just to describe the value of data that now exist. Data are pervasive, they're ubiquitous, they come in many forms, and they're growing like mushrooms in the dark. No longer numbers just text, audio, they're now visual, they're pretty much everything. So when we talk about digital, we're talking about data. When we talk about artificial intelligence, we're talking about data. When we talk about algorithms, we're talking about data. When we talk about trade and services, we're talking about data. So I think Rory was right when he said, effectively, we're talking about life, the universe, and everything now when we talk about data. Okay, so in terms of background then, I think data is probably one of the words that really defines the age that we're in. We now, we hear the word data revolution. We've had all sorts of revolutions in the past. I think we really are living through a data revolution. And data have assumed an importance to our economies, to our society, to our politics that just was unimaginable 20 years ago. They're now a globalized commodity. They're easily shared. They're easily duplicated. They're traded. Effectively, they're the glue that binds and drives the digital economy, the cloud, blockchain, the Internet of Things. So they're literally everywhere. As Mark noted, they promise peril. They're a tool for liberation, but potentially also a weapon for exploitation. They transcend borders, and this is a really important issue that UNCTAD have brought out, is that they really challenge national sovereignty in a way that just really challenges kind of the current political architecture. And they're increasingly thought as a new form of capital. And while some regions are beginning to address parts of this and regulate elements of this, we see a very piecemeal, fragmented approach. And this actually introduces risks to production, to trade, to innovation, and to international cooperation. So what prompted the CCSA to start thinking about this really was two things. One was World Statistics Day, which was the 20th of October last year. And we were trying to think of something meaningful to say on this second of the World Statistics Day. But simultaneously, the World Bank approached us and asked us, would we be interested in writing a piece for their World Development Report on governance. Simultaneously, a little delayed, but a little bit afterwards, UNCTAD also interviewed some of us in preparation for their digital economy report. So we kind of realized that the discussions that we were having internally were actually happening elsewhere as well. And that's what prompted us to write the piece. So if you go to section 8.1 of the World Development Report, you'll find the actual, the chapter that's written by the CCSA. We've also posted blogs on the World Economic Forum and various other places. But what we were really kind of questioning was data can be used for a huge variety of purposes, but they're local, they're national, they're global. They affect all of these public policies. They affect commercial activity, they affect emergencies. So there's this huge, wide array of actors. And that introduces some challenges. So the first question we were kind of asking is, how do we balance the well-being of people and communities and ensure that they gain insight from their data? So this is back to the data colonialism issue that Rory mentioned. And how do we balance that against the need for privacy and shield them from misuse and abuse? So this is really, in a way, the individual versus community. How do we strike a balance between those two necessary kind of points on the spectrum? The second one is how do we find a balance, or how do we find equilibrium between the idea that we want data to be a public good, to help society, but realizing that data are now a proprietary good, and the commercial interests have a legitimate reason to hold on to their data. So again, we have another spectrum with two very different perspectives. So how do we protect data as a public good, not just in the economic sense, but in the broader sense, but at the same time realizing that data are now critical to business and their commercially interest. So how do we recognize the private sector perspective, and how do we balance these two competing needs? And then how do we best support competition, a thriving and diverse market for innovation? So how do we do all of these things with this one thing called data? How do we strike a balance between all of these things? Our thinking led us to think, well, maybe what we need is something called a data convention. And just what I realized when we published the first blog, now we've stuck with the term. Quite a few people misunderstood. We're not calling for another meeting. So we already have the World Data Forum. We don't want another meeting. What we wanted was like a convention, like a Bill of Rights. So something akin to the Declaration of Human Rights, or something like that, where we would try and set out something in principle, where we set out the principles where the need for safe and ethical use of data. And it's back to this idea that the World Bank have come up with, this need for a social contract that strikes a balance between the need to use data for development, to protect the poorest, but yet protect security, privacy, human rights, and commercial use and public good. It's a huge ask, I realize, but this is what we're thinking. And we thought this would come in a set of universal kind of data principles and standards. And similarly, maybe to what UNCTAD have proposed, some sort of an institution, maybe a UN institution, maybe not. Because one of the real differences, unlike any of the previous kind of international architecture, this would have to include government, but also public institutions, private sector, civil society, because data now is owned and shared by all of these different people. So this would be a completely new type of architecture. And ideally, this would move beyond standards and actually try and address incentives towards compliance. So I understand that this is an enormous ask, but nevertheless, given the importance of the topic that we're discussing, I think this is something worth considering. So, as I said, it's a challenging prospect. We're not naive. We understand there's massive divergence and competing interests. As Rory pointed out, that this is essentially a convention on everything. And perhaps there's nevertheless, just because something hasn't been done before, it doesn't mean it can't be done, and it doesn't mean we shouldn't at least discuss it. In thinking about this, I'm reminded of the story of Pandora's box in Greek mythology, where Zeus is annoyed because Prometheus has stolen fire, so he creates this wonderful creature called Pandora and gives her a box and says, whatever you do, don't open the box. And eventually curiosity gets the better of her. She opens it and out flies pestilence, war, destruction, famine. And she gets such a fright, she closes the box. And the one thing that's trapped in the box is hope. And I kind of feel something similar has happened. We've opened the box and we've let data fly out, we've let algorithms fly out, we've let all of this stuff fly out. And now we're in terror, we're going to shut the box. And the one thing that's going to be trapped inside with hope will be governance or regulation. So what I'm saying is, look, we've opened the box now, so let's open it and let's finish the job. Let's really tease out these issues and see, can we explore these issues? So look, I'll finish on that. If anybody's interested in kind of looking at this, we've published a number of blogs. I think there'll be another blog published this week on the World Data Forum Hub. The blogs are short and they're deliberately vague. When I say they're deliberately vague, is we don't see ourselves as being the architect of this convention. We see ourselves as just putting out the question and asking people. What we're really trying to assess is the appetite. Is this something that's worth discussing, or is it the dumbest idea you've ever heard? So, as I said, so that's why we've been deliberately vague. We've put out more questions than answers, but we think, as a group, we think this is worth exploring. So I'll finish there. Thank you, Chair.
All right. Thank you, Steve. And so I have this chair's angst now that we have 6 minutes left. I don't even know how much I'm allowed to run over, so I won't even ask that question yet. I have 2 questions online that I've seen that I would like to pose. And whilst that is happening, I think, Steve, you said you would kindly wander around with a microphone. Maybe we can take a couple from the floor as well. So while that is starting on the floor, let me highlight the 2 questions that I see in the Q&A online. One of them is particularly directed at you, Rory. Could you please elaborate on how commercial incentive suppression, or maybe control, would limit the use of data for development? But others are welcome to chime in. And another statement and question is that data cover too many areas of application. What are the most important provisions that countries need to focus on, and even before there's necessarily a working convention? So those 2 are in the air, and we have 2 microphones.
Okay, is this working?
Yes, please introduce yourself.
I'm Jim Ridgway from Durham University in England.
Thank you.
Rory warned us against the convention on everything. I'd just like to ask each speaker, if you had a convention on just 2 things, what 2 things would you want consensus on?
Excellent, thank you. Can we focus? Can we prioritize? Or will it be everything? Was there another mic? Oh, no, it's 1 microphone moving. Okay, thank you.
My name is Urszula Marchlewicz. I'm from Poland. I'm marketing management agency, and I would like to say that I have the solution for all the questions, because yes. It was it is a model of human development, because the data is data was data. Nobody asked what data is for what. It is for human life, for a reason. So I started 2004 in the European Union. What development is? It is realizing set of clearly defined commodities: breathing, drinking, eating, health, culture, security, infrastructure. Also, it is set of needs. It is the same for all people, and the people realize the needs by goods and services, responding goods and services, and then they check and improve, and they should use the knowledge. It is the clue is the knowledge is the motor of whole human existence. So the cognizing, which is built internal and then expressed also. Could be expressed or not. It is very important expressing. And I built the model. It was verified scientifically by 3 global higher engineering conferences, also appreciated by Ernst & Young by inviting me the World Investment Conference Labai. And then also, and 4 years ago, it was the model I built, precised functioning, actual functioning of countries by institutions, by GDP method, and national accounts and corporate accounts also. And yes, and then 4 years ago I finished it and aligned it with the agenda and with the 2030 agenda and all SDGs. And it is so I have it, so I would like to forward to the United Nations for all to understand. And the core model I implemented the European Union by programs. 10 years I taught the students. I made development action with many regions from the Union. Oh,
Thank you.
So
Thank you.
So I
Thank
give
you very much. So please do forward it. Yes, it will be fascinating. Thank you very much. In the last 2 minutes, would our esteemed speakers online, who I don't see, but I'm sure you're still there, and next to me, maybe we'll start with you, Rory.
Sure. So I would prioritize cross-border data. I think the key is data has to flow to be useful. It needs to be aggregated to be useful. That's where you get the analytics power is unleashed. But for that to happen, you need to have safeguards. You need to avoid the absolute misuse, abuse, invasion of privacy. It's a strategic issue where today having all the data on another country's population, which now you can if you operate companies that have the degree of insight into people's lives. They know where they live, how much they spend, what they spend it on, what their interests are, whether it's TikTok or Facebook or otherwise. This is now strategic issues. So we need to have something that allows the data to flow in a way, nevertheless, that respects national security concerns and privacy. And I think that relates to I'll just use the same theme for the concern about suppressing commercial incentives. For example, there are countries which are outright prohibiting cross-border data flows for that sort of reason. Similarly, at a national level, for example, Uganda's data protection law prohibits the sale of any personal data. Just boom. That kind of really stops in its tracks an awful lot of what you can do. I think the key thing is to facilitate flow, but making sure it's very responsibly regulated.
Excellent. Thank you, Rory. Pilar, I see you. Would you like to comment on any of the questions?
Yeah, I would like to, basically, the only one I really can comment is basically on this prioritization. But the point is that really the problem with data is that they imply so many things and they are multidimensional. So prioritizing is a problem because the need is to look at them in a holistic way. So as Rory was also saying, you can prioritize, as I mentioned, there are different policy objectives by policymakers, like it can be economic development, it can be security, but if you act on one side, you have an impact on the other. So it's very important to look at the interconnection because we are really now in this digital world, it's all about interconnection and interdependence. So the prioritization is not so easy. And I would agree also with Steve. in the report, we are also pointing, and because in this world we have more questions than answers. So the idea is that we need to rethink things in a different world, in a different way.
Different way.
So this would be the main point.
Thanks
in
very
that.
much, Pilar.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Malar, are you still there? I'm looking out into cyberspace to see you.
Yes, I'm still there. But we have
Excellent.
been super brief, just along the lines of what Pilar and Rory have already pointed out. I think at a very high level, it's about, I think the important thing to prioritize is data flows, whether it's across borders or within countries. And I guess with a focus on regulations that especially focuses on safeguards, data protection regulations. So I agree with Pilar that it's going to be really hard to prioritize, but I think there's value in thinking about such a convention, which could help with the building of these standards, which countries can sort of agree on, with need to facilitate this cross-border cooperation, but allowing enough flexibility to, frame your own national policies that link to your own national priorities. So I think it's really important to think about, because right now there's a lot of black box, especially when we're getting into all of the artificial intelligence and machine learning, and it's a lot of black box and opaque processes which you want to unpack.
Yeah.
I'll just stop with that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Malar. Steve on my left.
Jim, it's like a box of chocolates and I have to pick one. But I actually think probably the overarching question is the one I mentioned about the spectrum between the individual and the community. I think if we could reach clarity on that, I think that would actually, by default, address a lot of the other things, because I think a lot of things like data sharing, movement of data, that all feeds into that. So I think the big question is, what's the right balance between me as a person and my place in society? And so, how much do I value work sharing with you so that we develop a better society? And how much do I value my own personal rights? I think that really is the fundamental question.
Thank you, Steve. Fundamental indeed. And you said you weren't calling for a whole new meeting, but I think the experience of this morning shows that an hour is certainly not nearly enough. So, data are everything, and so that makes it challenging and interesting and exciting, balancing individual rights and community rights, the rights or the necessities of the private industry to be able to continue pushing the envelope and developing what it does, whilst protecting everybody at the same time. It's massive, it's enormous, and we have been trying to choose which chocolate we would take first, but even those chocolates seem pretty big to me. So I'm doubtless offending a lot of other people who would like to ask questions now, but statistically the difference between allowing 2 more and allowing 0 more is probably not significant, so I'm just going to offend everybody else. And going to declare time for some coffee, time for some online or in-person continued discussion of this really important topic. Clearly, we're just starting, and there's a lot that we can do together. So thank you very much, everybody in the room. Thank you very much, everybody online. And particularly thank you to Malar and Pilar and Rory and Steve for stimulating this and bringing different views, which we hope we can make work well together to make a difference. So thanks, everybody.
Recording stopped.